Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stephen Jordan. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Sustainable Development, and we are very pleased once again for 2026 to be doing this joint series of webinars with Statebook and Calandra Cruikshank. And we are thrilled because resilience and community continuity is perhaps more critical than ever. And yet, there are a lot of questions about what it is exactly. So, in this webinar, we're going to dive in to provide an overview of some of the key concepts that will help, particularly for economic development officers and people who are concerned about the economic development of their communities, to have some keys for the future. As always, for those who are watching this as a recording, if you have additional questions, please email info@isdus.org and we'll be happy to connect with you offline. With that, I'm really going to turn it over right now to Calandra Cruikshank, the CEO of Statebook, to kick us off for this year. Calandra, thank you very much. You're a great partner.
Thanks so much, Stephen. And it's a pleasure to be here. And I think it might help if we just do a quick introduction before we jump into the presentation. So I'm Calandra Cruikshank. I'm founder and CEO of Statebook, which is a location intelligence data and analytics company working with economic development organizations and Fortune 500 companies across the country with location analytics to provide more holistic, data-driven insights and evidence-based strategies for everything from corporate site selection to economic development strategy and planning to resilience building. And Stephen, if you want to do a quick intro and then maybe Steve, and then we'll jump right in.
Sure thing. Stephen Jordan, I've been with the Institute for Sustainable Development since 2018. Uh, I've been actually working on these issues for the last 25 years. We have a deep interest in long-term development that works for everyone. So our goal is to create structures and frameworks that empower people, particularly at the state and local levels, to improve the quality of life for all of their people.
And Steve?
Great. Thank you, Calandra. Steve Kaufman. I'm currently a consultant. I have a little one-man operation, Foresight Consulting. But before that, I was with the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency for almost 6 years as the chief of the Resilient Services Branch, where we developed the tools that protective security advisors use in the field for conducting security and resilience assessments. We ran the Regional Resiliency Assessment Program, so looking at resilience of critical infrastructure at the regional scale. That could be anything from a municipality across state borders and even across international borders in some cases. And prior to joining CISA, I was with the National Institute of Standards and Technology for 19 years, where I started the Community Resilience Program. And that grew out of the work that we had been doing for a long time, looking at extreme loads on buildings primarily, but then recognizing that buildings were just really a part of the equation, that community resilience really dealt with maintaining the services and functions that we depend on every day for our lives and livelihoods. And so I'm happy to kind of bring that experience and background to the conversation today.
Thank you so much. So, we're going to jump in with one of the sort of foundational premises that we are all about here, which is ensuring that there's an evidence-based approach to resilience. And what that really means is you heard both Steve and Stephen talking about the importance of approaching this with a very holistic perspective. And at Statebook, what we do is bring that really from a data-driven perspective and how we are able to provide, like, break down silos and be able to provide a holistic view across regions, communities, etc., in a way that allows a very holistic perspective when you're looking at resilience. So with our tools, um, you can, oh, can you guys still see my screen? Statebook is up?
Yes, we can
Okay,
see it.
good. Perfect. I just got a little message flashing that maybe it wasn't there. Okay, good. So I just randomly chose Tampa here as an example, but within Statebook, we provide a whole slew of different types of visualizations across all of these data points that are really critical for um, resilience and decision making. So, as a really quick example of how you would use Statebook for resilience, one of the measures that we bring in is the FEMA National Risk Index, and you can measure the overall index or uh, risk from any particular peril, coastal flooding, hurricanes, wildfires, tornadoes, wind, etc. And you can identify the very high risk areas or relatively high risk, etc. And you can focus on a particular census tract in this case, as just one example. Or you could look across the entire region and identify risk. But one of the ways that you could use Statebook in this case, and this kind of, again, just lays the framework for how you approach understanding what the risks are, you could see where risk is at a particular census tract, and then you could say, okay, I understand that a lot of times people who are in poverty tend to live in these high risk areas, right? So you could look at what percent of the people are in poverty, what percent of people don't speak English, so may need translation services in the event of a disaster. What are the industries that are going to be impacted, or how many first responders are in the area to be able to respond to an incident? Looking across infrastructure, you could say, well, is there a power plant or a bridge that's at risk, or a dam that could be at risk? And where are the hospitals to treat people? Where are the physicians? So there are lots and lots of different ways to look at this data, and you can also visualize the data in different ways. Like, so if you wanted to see in this area, what is the total expected annual loss, and the fact that that is from hurricanes for buildings versus hurricanes and tornadoes and lightning for people, and from drought and hurricane for agriculture, right? So, and all of our data visualizations can be downloaded right from here to add to your report or your grant application. So, I just wanted to share this kind of really holistic view of the information with you before we jump into the presentation, so that you understand that you can really have that as a foundation um, for the kinds of decision making that need to be made, and not just the decision making, identify the gaps and the needs and the risks, but also developing your resilient strategies as you go forward. And with that, Steve, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Calandra. So Calandra set the stage very well, I think, because what I learned over time in working in this area is that, you know, what we often see on TV and in the news about disasters is the damage to buildings and sometimes infrastructure. What we're really talking about with communities are these complex systems of systems that include the societal dimensions, economic dimensions, the physical buildings and infrastructure, and also the natural environment in which communities exist. And these dimensions are dependent or interdependent on one another. And so when we talk about community resilience or community continuity, the first thing we really have to do is understand how these systems interact and are connected to each other, where there's the possibility that disruptions can occur, and disruptions that can actually propagate and do what I call, taking the hazard event to the point where it leads to a disaster. So what's important then is to really understand how communities function on a day-to-day basis, where there are risks that could lead to significant disruption, and develop response plans to meet needs during the period before services are restored, so that we keep people in place, we can keep businesses operating and generating some revenue so they can remain operable. And then while we're in the recovery phase, mitigate risks so that we reduce the risk to future events. Next slide, please. So this is kind of the classic resilience curve. You have what people think of as kind of a steady state, and I'm going to talk about why that's not really realistic in just a moment. But then there's an event of some sort, and there's a loss of capacity to deliver services, or what you can consider a disruption. And the response takes place during that phase. This is, meeting immediate needs, rescuing people, um, you know, responding to failures of buildings and infrastructure. And as we get to a period of stabilization, and there's not a clear demarcation where response ends and recovery begins, it's kind of a blended um, space. But in that recovery phase, we have things stabilized, and now we're building back the capacity. We're rebuilding buildings, we're repairing or restoring infrastructure. Hopefully, we're mitigating risks to future events. And at some point, you reach a stage of being fully recovered and a new normal. Next slide. The reality is really different. If you have a community that is economically vibrant, socially well connected, is thriving, they're on sort of an upward trajectory, so that when that hazard event occurs, there may be a disruption, but as you go through the response and recovery phase, you're actually returning to a new normal that is better than the stage or the condition pre-event. The opposite is a decline in community, not resilient. And so when that event occurs, there's significant disruption. People are displaced, they may move away, and there's a new normal that occurs. And that new normal could actually be a condition that is worse off than the condition pre-event. We've seen this in some events over the years, post-hurricane, where you see a significant number of people leaving because they don't have housing, they don't have employment, they go to another location, and maybe they don't come back. And the new normal actually may be very different than the condition before the storm. Next slide. So when you think about resilience, and there are a number of definitions for what resilience really means, but essentially, a resilient outcome is where the level of disruption to services can be absorbed by the community without any negative impacts. Negative impacts being outmigration, business closure, or business displacement. So if we understand how the community operates under normal conditions, where key dependencies exist, and how those dependencies influence resilience, is essential to executing actions that lead to resilient outcomes. I said earlier, disruption can include damage or destruction to buildings, which leads to or can lead to displacement. It can be a loss of infrastructure services such as energy, water, wastewater, communications, transportation, in which case people don't have the essential services they need to remain in place while the response completes, and to be there to begin the process of restoration. And it can also result from disruptions to services or infrastructure that occur outside the area of interest. An example of this, I did some work while I was at CISA, and we were talking to a nursing home association for this particular area. And as they went through kind of understanding what their dependencies were, they found that all of their supplies came across a bridge that had a gas main running underneath it. And that bridge and the gas main were at risk of scour in a flood event. And if the if there was significant scour around the gas main, then that would lead to a closure of the bridge, which would mean that now these supplies going to the nursing homes would be disrupted or at least delayed. And so that was their critical dependency. It was not some of the things we normally think about. And as I said, disruption leads to displacement of residents, or it can lead to displacement of residents. It can lead to business disruption or closure, and it can also result in long, difficult periods of recovery. Next slide. So, sorry, I'll go back, Sam,
Oops.
or Calandra. Yeah,
Sorry
thank
about
you.
that.
No, no problem. So this just kind of gives you an example. This is a series of images I had my team put together while I was at CISA, but there's a lot of invisible infrastructure services in our communities. Communications, transportation, energy, and water and wastewater we see on the surface, but then there are dependencies that exist among these different dimensions. So water, wastewater cannot operate without energy. If there's no energy and they're operating on backup power, now they're dependent on transportation, they're dependent on fuel services. So you can see that there's this network of dependencies that are present in any community. Next slide. So I just wanted to kind of, pull this back to a case study. Many of you may be familiar with the floods that occurred in Washington State in December due to the atmospheric rivers that were impacting the state. There was a town, Mount Vernon, Washington, that had for about a decade been working on addressing their flood risk. And the reason that the city wanted to address the flood risk was that they had plans to develop their downtown area. And part of the problem that they faced was being able to attract investment insurance if they were at significant risk of flooding. And they'd had experience with floods over the years. This flood wall that they undertook was completed in 2018. As I said, it was part of the city vision to invest in the downtown area. But that flood wall allowed the city to remove 225 buildings from the 100-year floodplain. What that did was reduce the cost of insurance, and it also made it easier for developers to obtain financing for projects. At the same time, it provided an amenity for the city residents. So during normal times, there's a river walk. There are places where you can pass through the wall to get to the river or get to the downtown area. So in normal times, it's an amenity, but in the event that a flood is anticipated, the flood wall can be installed in a matter of hours. And you can see in the image on the left, the height of the river, and on the right, there's some water that's kind of trickling through the flood wall, but it's minimal and there was no flooding in the downtown area. So this is a success story. The total cost of the project was just under $31 million. Most of that funding was provided by the state. But now what it's done is, kind of set the stage for the city to embark on their economic development plans and begin developing their downtown area. Next slide. So I'm just going to close with a couple of key elements for achieving resilient outcomes. First of all, resilience planning requires broad engagement by all stakeholders. When I work with a local area, I often go in and say, I'm not here to tell you how to solve your problem. I'm really here to ask questions. There's a lot of local knowledge that exists. People know how hazards have affected them or affected their neighbors. And those insights are critically important to really understanding what the city's needs are or the local needs are and how those feed into resilience planning. There also needs to be a shared vision for a desired future. The case study in Mount Vernon is a good example. There was a lot of civic engagement that had taken place. So the city had a vision for what they wanted to achieve. The residents had participated in that planning. And that led to a kind of a phased approach for meeting their visions and building resilience in as a part of that process. Um, there needs to be a very clear understanding of the current and future threats and impacts to the community. Again, going back to the Mount Vernon example, the city actually worked with, I believe it was the University of Washington, to look at their flood threats uh, for toward to the end of the century, so that they were sure that this investment was going to have pay off not only in the near term but in the longer term. And finally, resilience needs to be integrated into all development actions, response, and recovery plans. I had the experience working with the city a number of years ago when I was still at NIST. The motivation for resilience planning was actually updating their hazard mitigation plan. Um, and so that was kind of what got us started. We had a broad engagement of stakeholders in the community through two workshops, and then a lot of work that the city did on their own. Um, the result was that they did have their updated hazard mitigation plan. They had inputs that went into their comprehensive economic development strategy. But a lot of things actually ended up going into their recovery plan. And the reason for that was that even though there was historical evidence of earthquake, hurricane, and flood in this particular location, the incidence of those hazards was fairly low. And so the city felt that they could actually afford to put a lot of their mitigation plans into their recovery plans. So if something did happen, they had a plan for how to respond and recover quickly. So with that, I'll stop and hand it back over to Calandra.
And actually, thank you so much, Steve. And I have a handful of questions for you, but we'll hold those to the end. And uh, Stephen Jordan, I think you are up, sir. You're on mute, though.
Thank you very much, Calandra. Next slide, please. I'm going to start by throwing out some numbers. In 1979, FEMA was founded to bring together a lot of different government agencies that were handling bits and pieces of emergency management. Since that time, casualties have decreased maybe 100-fold. When you look at it, it is absolutely amazing that with Hurricane Helene, uh, only 230 people were killed. And yet it was as damaging and encompassed many more people than Katrina, which only 20 years ago caused almost 2,000 people to die. You look at the Los Angeles wildfires of 2025, and believe it or not, only 30 people died. What we have done is we have created an emergency management framework that is very, very good at minimizing the loss of life and at making sure that casualties and people are taken care of. What we haven't done is we have not addressed the economic and social costs of disasters. And we have also not thought through the economic benefits of creating a resilience mentality ahead of time. So the process that Leanne Hackman Cardy and I developed about 6 years ago, we call it the READI process because it's really about changing your mindset, getting and really understanding and defining the problems that you have before you design and develop kind of the new platform that you're going to have. And it is absolutely imperative to do so. Over the last 5 years, from 2020 to 2025, the United States had an average of $150 billion in economic costs. In 2024, 11 million people were displaced. To this day, we have a fellow located in Swannanoa, and even though the Hurricane Helene took place in September of 2024, housing funds for have not been dispersed for many of the lowest income families that vitally need that kind of support. The result is that we have a situation where we are managing for emergency management, but we're not managing for disaster management. It's really, and the other issue that Steve Kaufman alluded to in his presentation is that we sit there and we don't think about minimizing the initial impacts, and we don't think about shortening the duration of the disasters. So we don't have a federal recovery agency. We don't have a federal let's avoid disasters in the first place agency. And as a result of that, the outcomes of the current system cause communities not just the economic costs of repairing it, but the lost economic revenue, the lost tax base of delayed recovery. Next slide, please. So when you look at it, this is like buying roses on Valentine's Day. You know, what you get is they're expensive, it's rushed, and it's suboptimal because all of the selection has been picked over. That's the current situation that we have. Whereas if you bought the roses 2 weeks ago, you'd have much better selection, much better quality, and they'd be cheaper. And that is the key insight for economic development leaders and for community leaders writ large, is that we need to think through how we can minimize the downside risks of impacts and shorten the recovery period so that we're able to have our community continue as seamlessly as possible. And this is the one last point I want to make about this is that for businesses, for investors, we always look at risk-adjusted rate of return. In other words, the United States only offers bonds at 3%, 5%, and yet they're oversubscribed. People around the world buy them. And yet in emerging markets, like Argentina, could sell a bond for 30%, high growth, but nobody would want to buy it because it was so risky. This is kind of the same mentality that we should really start to think about with our communities. It's not so much that we just focus on growth for its own sake, but that we really start to think through, are we reducing the downside risk of living in our community as well? Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry, you have the wrong presentation up.
Huh.
Do you mind if I share my screen?
Sure.
Okay. Okay. All right. Share. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay.
But
This,
if you could go into presentation mode, that would be super helpful.
of course. Okay. So part of like the baseline of starting to design a community continuity framework is a change in mindset, not just looking at the impact side and how we're doing emergency response, but thinking through how are we setting ourselves up to reduce risks during normalcy? How do we think about stabilization? How do we think about the long-term recovery? And what are the outcomes that we want to get to? And this is as much about finance and investment and infrastructure and insurance as it is about the mechanics of emergency response. There are different skill sets that are actually involved if you want to make sure that you have the optimal goals in mind, which is not to have a problem in the first place. You know, Steve, you were talking about that town in Washington, Mount Vernon, Washington. For me, people ask me all the time, what is the greatest, the most successful disaster management concept that I know of? And I would point to the Nisqually earthquake of 2001. A lot of people don't know about it, but it was a magnitude 6.8 earthquake. And yet, I think there was a single casualty. A man died of a heart attack. And but Seattle and Tacoma, where the Nisqually earthquake took place, came sailing through because they had invested in the retrofits. They had invested in public education. They had invested in communications, and they'd also invested in something that we increasingly think is important, which is a community resilience network. And I'm going to get into that a little bit later on. But so the first thing that we have to think about as we do this is not to think about disaster management just in the sense of how do we react to it. We have to start becoming more proactive. And this means that we need to reduce risk across the range of community layers. Steve's already talked about the infrastructure layer. The enterprise layer is pretty self-explanatory as well. Over 60% of businesses, including small businesses, have some kind of business continuity plan, right? But what you'll find when if you're an enterprise or if you're a community, if the schools are closed, the individual's going to stay home. If the parents are sick, they're going to stay home. There's so many things at the individual level that we need to look at in order to strengthen continuity. Similarly, when we look at the community level, there's a fundamental relationship between that and the individual. But the community level also entails our brand, our marketing. One of the examples that really hit home for us was after the Thomas Fire in 2017. There was a huge debate in Santa Barbara and Ventura about talking about the closures and what was wrong with the mudslides and everything. Famously, there was a mudslide affected Ellen DeGeneres and Oprah Winfrey's neighbor, I think, and talking about how vibrant and what the opportunity was to come to Santa Barbara and Ventura County. And and so those are the kinds of things that you have to think about actually before a disaster happens. When you're designing things afterwards, there's a saying actually in emergency management that's awesome. The worst time to exchange business cards is the day of the disaster. The worst time to be thinking about all of these consequences is after the disaster has happened. So that's the R, reorientation, reconfiguration, thinking through what are the outcomes that you want to achieve. The E is about evaluation and engagement. And again, Steve, in his excellent presentation, talked about how important evaluation is, not just in terms of the specific layer of water or the specific layer of energy, but how these different support systems relate to each other. You can have something that is, say, an information technology failure affect the way that your ability to make decisions around your traffic lights, for example, your transportation system. The important piece about evaluation is that it also gives you a handle not just about, oh, this is wrong, this could go wrong, this could go wrong, but it also helps you to think through what are your core assets and what do you need to do to protect those. Again, we're not just talking about risk management from a negative standpoint, we're also talking about risk management from a positive standpoint, how you make it work. And because of these interdependencies, just talking amongst yourselves, just having like a whole of government approach where it's just government people talking to government people is not enough. Over 80% of all infrastructure is owned or operated by private businesses. Similarly, you need to engage the media. Messaging and communications are so important throughout the process. I can't tell you how many times at the beginning of a disaster, there's been misinformation, missing information, disinformation. Having a media game plan before the disaster happens and engaging proactively is super important from a continuity perspective. And obviously, you can't do anything really without the buy-in of your community. And the added benefit of having this engagement mentality is that it helps you to start building social capital and trust, which often after disasters just goes completely out the window. Again, one of the things that is a key to success and which saves, believe, I don't mean to be crass, but it saves a lot of money, is the ability of the community to trust that the systems are going to work. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but this is an example of the kind of assets that you want to be thinking through how you're maximizing and how you're minimizing the downside costs to. Notice that we look at the environment as an asset to be managed. We look at it as actually a critical component of the overall quality of life of your community. And uh, I could just do a whole class just on that one issue. But again, risk management is an asset. Your heritage is an asset because it goes to your identity and to the social capital that you have. So, just to recap, we're looking at reorienting towards the desired outcomes. We're looking at evaluation engagement. We're looking at our assets and how we can add capacity and mitigate the threats and vulnerabilities to them. And these are some, in the interest of time, I'm gonna to skip over this, but these are some of the critical tools that should be going into your community continuity framework. And I will say this. Um, People think that they're prepared and people think that they're covered. But when you look at Hurricane Helene, for example, in many of these counties up in Appalachia, less than 1% of the people that were affected in them had the right kind of insurance for the damages that they incurred. If we're going to be starting to talk about community continuity, we need to start thinking about different kinds of risk management tools at the community level. If you have a situation where your lowest income folks are most at harm, it may behoove you to start thinking in terms of parametric insurance or other group insurance products. And unfortunately, in the United States, this is not a mindset that a lot of people have. Again, once we start to reorient our thinking, then a lot of this stuff starts to make sense. But it's absolutely critical, actually, for a lot of these communities, for a lot of our rural areas, small towns, that we start thinking this way. Finally, we would say, then you get to design and development. Once you have a handle, here's the thing about it, is that if you know where you want to go, i.e., you want to reduce your impacts, you want to shorten the duration of recovery, you want to continue to grow your trajectory. If you know what point B is and you know what point A is, where you are currently, in terms of your relationships, your networks, your assets, your threats, your vulnerabilities, and everything, then the design process starts to fall into place. And as we talk about designing this framework, you need to have strategies for each part of the disaster management cycle. And then finally, this is about investment, implementation, and iteration. Need to have a mentality of continuous improvement. Now, one of the things that we get a lot of pushback on is, look, Stephen, we don't have the budget for this. We're not configured for this. We don't have a chief resilience officer. We don't have any of these things and everything. And for us to do this, it would be incredibly cumbersome. And there's a lot of vested interests that go against this way of thinking and all the rest of it. Put it into perspective. If if you were able to save between $4 and $30 or whatever the latest figure is for averting a threat, in some cases, this isn't just about reducing your shock costs. It's also existential. It's also about preserving who you are and your identity. So this is why the investment case particularly if you are in an area that's vulnerable to sudden shocks, really justifies itself. You know, Steve, you may know this better than I do, but apparently there was a project by the Verrazano Bridge where if you'd created a breakwater, it would have saved about 15 to 17 billion dollars worth of damages. But the reason from Superstorm Sandy, but the reason that they didn't do it is because it cost $1 billion, right? If they had spent that $1 billion, they would have saved not just that 17 or 18 billion dollars, but the opportunity cost of having to repair all of those things, the lost economic productivity that they had as well. So so once you start to understand what your situational environment is, the justification for the investment starts to write itself. The other piece of this is implementation. It's one thing to do the plan. It's another thing to start to exercise it and to start to implement. And when we talk about implementation, we're talking about having kind of a short-term game plan, a mid-term game plan, and a long-term game plan. Some of the investments that you're going to make, like Frederick creating their flood management system, may take 5, 10 years to do. But some of these things can be implemented in relatively short order. In this case, for example, we created a community resilience network with Los Angeles County, the Los Angeles Chamber, the Los Angeles Economic Development Corporation, and a couple of other regional business organizations to start sharing information after COVID. And what that helped to facilitate was enhanced communication, coordination, collaboration between the public and the private sectors, better flow of information so that we could understand not just in terms of the data, but in terms of the of being able to identify the actual people who were members of X, Y, or Z part of this, where the pain was happening the most. And we were able to, because we were creating a network, we were able to start building trust between different members of the network and the communities that were being represented by other parts of the network. So it was great from, say, the utilities perspective to be able to talk to some of these other constituencies. It was great from the government's perspective to be able to drive some of this information. And and the result is that when the 2025 wildfires happened, we actually had Together for LA stood up 2 days after it started, and we were able to get a lot of resources out the door much faster than we had ever done before, just because everybody knew each other and we had kind of gone through this in the past. That being said, there's always room for improvement. And so this is one of those things that is a process and that you need to keep iterating to make sure that you get it right or get it better each time as you go forward. So that's the ready process in a nutshell. Obviously, I just provided a high level overview that you could unpack and talk about for many hours. But with that, I'll stop there and let's go to questions. Thank you very much.
Just before we jump into questions, I want to just touch really briefly on a resource that another ISD fellow, David Dodd, created. He's with the Institute for Sustainable Development and another I'm sorry, I always get those two confused. You're the Institute for Sustainable Development, and David is the International Sustainable Resilience Center. And he created an economic resilience scorecard that helps to provide a framework for some of the things that Stephen was just alluding to in terms of building those networks ahead of time and putting the framework in place so that if and when a disaster of any sort, man-made, natural hazard, cyber, etc., hits your community, you have those relationships that Stephen was talking about already in place for the to hit the ground running and be ready for it. And so just to show you a super quick example, this is the economic resilience scorecard. In this case, it is integrated into a digital SEDS platform for South Delta in Mississippi. But here you can see it's asking a series of questions, and then there's a self-assessment portion, and then it provides an entire step-by-step framework on how to improve resilience across your region. And as you take the steps, you can then improve your resilience score, and that gives you the ability to have two things. One is um, something that you can point to for your resilience requirements from EDA, for example, for grant funding and so forth. And the other thing it allows you to do is have really tangible and concrete talking points and established scores and frameworks that you can show to potential funders to show how you have how you're ensuring business continuity in your community, and to businesses that might be looking at your region for investment, for locating a facility there. And at this point today, everybody knows that no matter where you locate, you're going to face some kind of threats. But the real key to Stephen and Steve's presentations is what steps have you taken to ensure business continuity, your ability to respond and recover from those impacts. And so here with the economic resilience scorecard, you'll see that the first question here is, have you established an economic resilience committee or task force? If you say yes, it asks if you have representatives from your local community, county, regional, state, EDA. And for each one that you say yes to, it brings you to a screen where it outlines everybody that you should have at the table ahead of time. So in the case of local community representatives, it's asking, do you have representatives from the public sector, city government, the mayor, planning, economic development, the private sector? Are your businesses represented? Banks, insurance companies? Do you have local NGOs represented, or first responders? So for each one, you can respond correctly, or not correctly, but affirmatively to, you gain points for your overall score. And then each question builds on the other. I'll give you one more example here, which is question number 3, which is, have you established a business emergency operations and recovery center? Even if you haven't started this yet, you now have this whole framework here that describes the purpose of standing this up, the potential partners that you need at the table, the role that this will play across the region to ensure resilience, the cost of implementation, and funding sources you can go to that may be able to cover some of those costs. An example of a community that has done this piece well, and a link that you can go see what they've done. So there's a 50 question questionnaire. You go through it. Each question gives you something to think about, a self-assessment piece, and then a full framework on what you can do to ensure the business continuity in your region. So with that, now we should go to Q&A. And I think we've had a couple in the chat, and Stephen and Steve, I think you're both maybe want to take a look at Jody's question, which was, I think,
Yeah, can I talk to that?
yeah, please. Do you want to
Okay,
read it just so
so
everybody, in case they haven't seen the chat?
okay,
I have it up.
let's go to this. One of the challenges is proving that investment upfront will have a positive ROI. If we succeed, the disaster never happens or is significantly mitigated so that the total probable cost cannot be calculated. Yeah, that's the same problem. Oh, and let me just finish. How do we get decision makers to invest in mitigation resilience building when they may never realize the ROI ever or in their term of office? Thoughts? Okay, so there are several ways to think about this during quote unquote peacetime. One is that your risk reduction may affect your insurance rates, as Steve alluded to before. It may free up financial investment. If you can take 200, what was it, Steve? 225 houses out of the floodplain, that's
Right.
a significant benefit right there. The third thing is that you can design your assets in such a way that they deliver multiple kinds of value. So, for example, with Frederick, Maryland, not only were they able to start avoiding devastating floods in the future, but they basically strengthened their downtown to a point where I would say it's kind of become a tourist destination in a way. I mean, they've got great food and all the rest of it, but they made it so that it was even more attractive. So I think that one of the things that you can do is that you can sell resilience investments just for the benefits during normal conditions. The second thing is that um, none of us ever hopes to use our insurance, and yet we buy it anyway. And resilience investment is a form of insurance. And that's part of how it would be. Yes, there may not necessarily be a future disaster because you have it, but it really helps your peace of mind that you've done it. Steve, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I do, Stephen. A couple of points. One, and I do agree with the observations you made. We actually tried to attack this when I was at NIST because, Jody, to your point, it's hard to sell resilience if nothing ever happens. And so one of my colleagues actually led an effort to develop what we called the EDGES tool, which was the economic decision guide. And essentially, what we tried to do was look at the benefits of investments in resilience, both in terms of losses avoided, as well as the day-to-day economic benefits that accrue. So if you go and look at the mitigation saves report that FEMA produced not too long ago, the average is $6 benefit for every dollar invested in resilience. But I think oftentimes the benefit is greater if the investment is made to, provide economic development in the community, and resilience is an element of that. So you're really focusing on the economic development or improvement in the community, contributions to the tax base, et cetera, rather than just focusing on the resilience aspect. The resilience aspect protects that larger investment. I'll go back. Jody made a point at the end of his question, or her question, sorry, about how do we get decision makers to invest. The Mount Vernon effort was interesting because it crossed mayoral administrations. So it started with one mayor who engaged the city. They developed a vision. The flood wall became a part of that. But then the new mayor came into office and realized that this was something that needed to continue, that they had actually really only completed phase one of this multi-phase plan to build economic development in the city of Mount Vernon. And so he's continued that effort. Resilience is a component, but not the end goal. The final point I'll make is that there are a number of ways to kind of get at this resilience question. One is looking at the policies that govern development. So actually removing conflicts in the policies that are embedded in the various plans that a community has that might lead to outcomes that are not resilient. For example, if you have a land use plan that says, don't build in the 100-year floodplain, and you have a comprehensive plan that wants to develop close to the water, those might be in conflict. And so identifying those conflicts, resolving them so that those planning documents are now aligned and you're removing those potential areas where you're making investments that might lead to less resilience rather than more as a positive. The other thing is building codes, and building codes can be enacted. They don't add a lot of cost typically. I know builders often, push back on any changes to building code that increase the cost of construction, but those costs are usually relatively small in the grand scheme of things. And so using building codes over time as a way to improve the quality of the building stock and actually reduce the risk of failure due to the hazards that are expected is a net positive. Um, so there are a lot of ways to get at the resilience question that don't actually involve large investments up front, but can lead to the positive outcomes that we're looking for.
Great,
I
thank you.
want to
And
I
I
want to
think,
talk.
yeah, go ahead, Stephen. I think we have a handful of other questions coming into the chat too. So
Yeah, I wanted to talk to the thing about stakeholders' capabilities. A lot
great.
of times there's a lack of awareness actually about what people are capable of. So in the nonprofit sector, they've created an umbrella group called the Volunteer Organizations Active in Disasters. And the Red Cross, Salvation Army, Samaritan's Purse, a lot of organizations are involved in that. And what you often see is that they coordinate among themselves, but then there's a whole host of churches, of faith-based groups, of spontaneously started local community groups that emerge, things like that. And that part is very, very difficult to get your arms around. And uh, but the result of this is that what you'll see sometimes is a lot of clumping, where a lot of resources get put into one particular geographic area, and then you see gapping, where there's swaths of places that nobody is helping out. And this is one of the reasons why we have been championing community resilience networks so much, is so that the left hand and the right hand start to know what to do. But and in this, the local chamber of commerce, your local EDO are very important for your business outreach. But I would not overlook kind of your business improvement districts and kind of your industry associations as well. Well, we're talking about for large cities in that case, but you're never ever really going to know what somebody's real capacity is until push comes to shove.
Yeah, and
And
I think
yeah,
too,
go ahead.
to your point, Stephen, that's why it's important to establish these networks up front so that everybody's committed, practiced, they know what to do. When a disaster hits, everybody has already established what their role is. And so it makes the that unknown of who has capacity a lot lower because everybody already has a role. They know how to react. The systems are in place to communicate and so forth.
Yeah, and I wouldn't discount just local residents. I mean, there's a lot of benefit that comes from storytelling, when you're doing the planning, but from past events, that helps communities really understand how disaster affects them and what can be done in the future to improve. So getting that broad stakeholder engagement is very important. And I see Chuck's comment in the chat about Rotary groups. Civic organizations are a prime place to get that engagement, because you're bringing people from different walks of life together in that organization. So anything you can do to get that broad stakeholder input is critically important.
So I know we only have a minute left here. I want to just have an opportunity, Steve, to talk a little bit about the Academy and what's available as a resource through that to organizations that might want to embrace the educational frameworks that you all have been developing.
Thank you. Steve, you want to say something first?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay. So the Institute has built up a network, with our partners, the International Sustainable Resilience Center, of close to 50 subject domain experts across that continuum that we've been talking about, whether it's parametric insurance, or it's debris removal or mental health or alternative solutions for recovering housing. We have tried to find the experts in the United States who have really worked on those issues most specifically. So, what we're offering is we're offering classes, we're offering webinars like these, and we also offer planning retreats and workshops in-house. And if you are interested in finding out more, email me directly. Calandra and Steve are both fellows of ISD, and uh, are happy to teach their knowledge as well. And thank you very
Great.
much, Calandra, for referencing that.
Yeah, and thank you both for joining this amazing webinar and providing these resources to communities. And thank you everybody who attended. And we look forward to collaborating with you soon.
Thanks very
Bye.
much.